All right, we're going to be picking up in verse 26 of chapter 9 here. Uh, this is going to be actually a good kind of segue into chapter 10, because the blind man, the discussion that we have with the blind man, I guess we shouldn't be calling him the blind man anymore because he's been healed. So the previously blind man, and then leading into the discussion about the good shepherd, there's a lot of correlation, a lot of similarities about reason, about hearing truth, hearing reason, hearing the Father, hearing the Son, and seeing the light. All of those things go very well together. Before we do that, let's just briefly recap what we've seen previously, because we're here in the middle of this discussion. Somebody just very briefly recap what we've seen thus far in chapter 9. What is the setting? How did we set up chapter 9? Where had Jesus just come from? Yes, he had just come from the temple. And why is he just coming from? Or what had he just done in the temple, and why is he leaving the temple at this point? It's one of many cases where there are those that are trying to kill him, right? So he passes through the midst of them after they try to stone him. And as he passes by, he sees this blind man. There's this discussion of did this man's parents sin, or did he sin? So that right off the bat, his disciples assume that sin has to be the result of why this man was born blind. Of course, we talked about some of those things as to why that would be a misnomer. But Jesus gives him various instructions. He spits on the ground, makes this clay, rubs it on his eyes, and he sees once more. And he tells him to go to the pool of Siloam to wash, and then he receives his sight there. And so then we enter into this. Jesus leaves the scene at this point. He goes off, and so I'll just call him the man. He's not the blind man anymore. The healed man now has this discussion with some of the Pharisees, very likely some of the same Pharisees that Jesus had just interacted with in chapter 8. Okay. And we see some similar arguments they've already made. What are some things that the Pharisees have begun to discuss with this man? What are some questions that are asked by them?
How he received his sight.
Yes. How did you receive your sight? Who did this to you? And of course, the blind man gives answers. They're not satisfied with those answers, as it would turn out. So then they go to the next best source, his parents, who would know him as well. And we see their interaction. They give some answers. They kind of throw it back on the son, saying he's of age, ask him. And why, or what does the text tell us the reason that they give that particular response? It's because of what? What's that? Yes, they had a fear of being removed from the temple, from the synagogue, from that society, from that way of life. That would have had a lot of ramifications in that day. Yes. So then in picking up in verse 24, they come to the blind man again. So this is the second testimony of him. And verse 25, we talked about this powerful testimony given by the man. At the very end of that verse, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. A very well thought out and just a simple truth that we talked about. Even we can base our faith on such simple things and go from there and then deal with the hard things. So picking up in verse 26, they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? So same question. Again, they ask him. Verse 27, what response do they give? Or what response does he give to the Pharisees here?
Well, he said, I already told you that. You want me to repeat it?
Yeah.
Well, something I never thought about, I mean, it's just a random comment, but before we did this study, I never paid attention to the fact that he was blind, and so he didn't see Jesus until later when Jesus said, "Do you believe in that I'm the Son of God?"
Right.
And I didn't, I never made that connection. Like, okay, So if he has visual impairment, then he
Hmm.
would be able to decipher that this is the same voice I talked to earlier. But maybe not.
Right.
Because of his response.
Hmm.
Or maybe that was carefully worded as well, but.
Right. Right. Yeah, he knows there are certain things that he does know, as we just alluded to. He knows that he was healed. He knows that it was a man. He assumes that it has to at least be a prophet, somebody from God. So he's made certain affirmations about this Jesus. He doesn't know him as Jesus yet. Yeah, that is an interesting thing. And I think that's we talked about this last Sunday, the building of the faith of this man. Because he has these discussions really in many ways by himself. He doesn't really have anyone to back him up through this whole discussion. It's just him and his thoughts, what he knows, what he's experienced. And there's a lot of good things for us there. So yeah, he says, I've already said this to you once. Do you want to hear it again? And, I don't know if this was said in sarcasm or with humor, but he says something it reads humorously to us, and it riles the Pharisees up. What does he say also in conjunction with that? Do you also want to become his disciples? Right? And that does not fly well with them. It's almost, kind of to your point, Kathy. I don't know why they've already heard this same testimony. Why would they ask this a second time? Perhaps they're hoping that he would change his testimony, that he would maybe, like his parents, kind of back off of this. I don't know. Mr. Leary?
I'm going to be talking about this today in my sermon, but they didn't want the truth.
Right.
That they wanted something else, and they needed something else, and
Yep.
whether it is to attack this man or whatever. They're not listening to know.
Yeah, they don't want
They're
to know.
listening to try to get to a position that they want. They think the truth ought to be something else.
Yeah. And I think maybe that's perhaps why they hope he'll say something else, because they know the answer they want, and they don't like what they're hearing. So yeah, they're trying to twist that truth once more. Okay, yeah, so it's exactly. So then continuing in the text, verse 28, who do they say, no, we're not his disciple. You are his disciple. We are disciple of who? Moses. Oh boy, here we go again. So they'd already appealed to Abraham and the works of Abraham, right? So now they're appealing to another Jewish forefather, Moses. This is rather interesting, given the context, given the discussion. So Israel and the Jews, the Pharisees in this instance, they believed that God spoke to Moses, right? Back in Exodus, when Moses first presented himself to Israel, to Pharaoh, that whole scene, he came and said that he was a spokesman for God. What were some things that left no doubt in the people's mind that this man was sent from God? What were some things that he did? 10 plagues. Some of those were worked through Moses's hand, of course, from God.
Sometimes he was given for the demonstration to Israel was his staff being able to
Yes.
turn into a serpent and his hand being leprous.
Yes.
He could repeat those two signs
to
prove that he was from God, those miracles.
Right. I would point to those. Those were the first ones. In fact, we have God demonstrating his power through Moses of the parting of the Red Sea. We have all of these things that we could point to. So they believed that Moses was from God because of these signs that he performed. Now Jesus has come and he performs greater signs. Some of the Gospels even go farther on that point, that he does signs greater than the prophets. And yet they don't believe Christ. And he is doing signs greater than Moses. He heals a blind man. Not only that, but he heals a blind man that was born from birth. To my count, we don't see that anywhere else in Scripture. Certainly not in the Old Testament. We don't see anyone born blind from birth being healed. So this is the first time that's happened. And yet they're saying, no, this man is a sinner. He has a demon. He's a Samaritan. They throw all these insults. They use pride. and throw all of those things against him. So it's really just an astounding demonstration of their lack of humility, their lack to listen, to hear, and to reason. And so that's certainly something for us to take to heart as well. Well, just continuing here, trying to wrap up this a little more quickly. So the man answered in verse 30, says, "Why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes." So again, he's saying, look, that I know this. He has opened, I was blind, now I see. This man has to be from God. You're saying that he's not from God. This is astounding to me. I'm astonished at this. In verse 31, now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Okay. So we've already had this discussion of those who walk in darkness. God cannot have part with those who walk in darkness. As 1 John tells us, God can have no association with darkness. He is light, in him is no darkness at all. So we have to worship him, do his will. And of course, Jesus had been appealing to the authority of the Father many times before this. I won't read those passages, but I invite you to read those for yourself in Proverbs 28 and 1 Peter 3. This is talking about who the Lord hears, those that come to him in good faith, those that listen to his laws, those that listen to his statutes. He hears these. Okay. So again, this is a demonstration. This man has a lot of reason. He has a good head on his shoulders. And he's able to discern certain things that these Pharisees are not able to do. In verse 34, once again, the Pharisees act with pride and insults. They say, you were completely born in your sins, and you are teaching us. And so at this point, they do end up casting him out of the synagogue and the temple. Okay, so of course, this flies in the face of many teachings, not only in the New Testament that we now have, but even the Old Testament. Ezekiel 18, the Son does not bear the sin of the Father. That whole chapter has that discussion being borne out there, and so that this is totally nefarious. They're just looking for a reason to cast him out because they don't want him to bear testimony.
And the disciples were asking the question at the beginning, who sinned?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so, but then they, they acted in the place of God. Mm-hmm. They just knew. Yeah. Because they. Yeah. That we talked about that yesterday in our Bible reading. When you get to the point of, I have the opinions of God, my opinions are the opinions of God. That's a dangerous place to be. Of course, Jesus has authority from the Father, but he only speaks where the Father has spoken. These were not. They were putting themselves in the place of God and on the throne of God. And we don't want to rise to that level. Should never do that. All right. So at this point, in verse 35, from near the beginning of the chapter until now, Jesus has left the scene. He is no longer in the scene, but in verse 35, he comes back, he finds the man, and he says to him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" He answered and said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you." And then he said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. I think it's evident that Jesus chose this man in particular because of the miracle that had been done. We already saw earlier in the chapter, it was this man, or Jesus says, this man was not born in sin, but he was born that God may be glorified. And so I think this whole discussion and this whole event is a demonstration of that. But not only is God glorified in that way, I think we also see, as we've already talked about, the great faith of this man, and God is glorified in that way, and great truths are put forward. And all this man wants is truth. He doesn't see any of the reasoning that the Pharisees bring to the table. He doesn't even consider those things. He holds on to what he knows. He doesn't let go of it. And at the very end here, it says that he worships Jesus. Just a side point, we never see Jesus refusing worship.
There are many angels that refuse that. We've seen in Daniel, that's been done. We see John in Revelation, he does that a couple of times where he bows before an angel and the angel refuses that worship. But here we don't see that. That is welcomed because, again, who is Jesus? He is the Son of God. He is deity. So I think that's just another small point that just kind of stacks onto the evidence of who Jesus is here. In verse 39, Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind." So Jesus has come for judgment to give sight to the blind and blindness to the sighted. The Pharisees ask in verse 40, "Are we blind also?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin, but now you say, 'We do see,' therefore your sin remains." So the blind long for light. They want light. They want darkness to be expelled. They want truth. And those who think they see end up rejecting it. When it's put before them, when light comes to them, they think they're accepting of light, but when it's actually presented to them, they don't want it, because as John chapter 1 alludes to, they love the works of darkness more than the light that has come into the world. So we have to see ourselves for who we truly are, that we are blind, we are full of sin, and we can't see the light until we accept it. We have to accept that light and put pride aside that the Pharisees had here and be much like the healed man in this instance. People that have been walking in darkness, it would seem their whole life, even they can change, even they can see the light if they have penitent, if they have hearts made of flesh that is able to penetrate and malleable. That is certainly a lesson for us as well. Any other thoughts that we have on John chapter 9 before we move into chapter 10 here? All right. John chapter 10. This is really, I think, in many ways, kind of a continuation of what we had just seen in chapter 9. It may have been that this was the same day. It may be a day after. Don't really know, but it's not long after, it would seem. At least part of the text is. So in this chapter, he reveals himself, Jesus does, to be the good shepherd, as I've already alluded to. And the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders in chapter 9, they are the ones who reject Jesus, and therefore they are blind. Well, in chapter 10, the discussion is going to come up that they also reject the shepherd. They do not hear the voice of the shepherd. The sheep hear the voice of their shepherd, and we'll get into that now here. So starting in verse 1, Jesus says here, "Most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." Notice here that Jesus does not take the time to explain what he's talking about here. He already assumes that the people know what he's talking about because they did know what he was talking about. Many of them would have lived in this shepherd culture, livestock and such things. I've never owned any livestock. I don't know if any of you have, if you've owned any sheep. I've known some that have actually bought sheep, preachers even, so that they can better understand this passage and they can help others. They can teach and exemplify some of the things that are talked about here. So this is a very real, this is a very applicable illustration for these people. So I do want to take the time for us to kind of break this down of what exactly is Jesus talking about here, because this can be some rather foreign language to us, and maybe we don't completely understand what he's saying. So a sheep rustler, or somebody who steals sheep, he's going to enter by, or he's not going to enter by the door, but he's going to climb in some other way, right? So I came across this article a couple of weeks ago, and it was about a sheep that was stolen from a field in England, and it was in the dead of night. They came, I think it was like 3 a.m. in the morning or something, and there are accounts of, I think they had some video footage even, of them throwing the sheep over the fence because they don't have access to the door. So they're going over another way, and then they have to haul those sheep a long way back to their vehicle. So they have to go to extreme lengths. This is not of ease. They're having to do all of these things in the dead of night where nobody can see them. But what Jesus describes here is that the shepherd comes in a way that is expected. He comes in a gentle way. He comes through the door, and we're going to kind of flesh this out even later. But oftentimes, even during this period, the shepherd would often lay down with the barrier of the sheepfold and act as a door. So the sheep would have to come through him in that way. Jesus is going to refer to himself as the door. Not only here, but in other places. And so I think there's something to say about that as well, to give comfort, to give security. And so it says here in particular, the shepherd enters by the door. Then we have this discussion about the doorkeeper in verse 3. So the doorkeeper and the sheep respond positively to the shepherd. So the doorkeeper, when he sees the shepherd approaching, gladly opens the door for the shepherd, or if he is about to leave the sheepfold to bring the sheep to water and to food, to sustenance, to the pasture, he gladly does that because he knows that the shepherd is there for the sheep. Now, opposite of that, if he sees somebody that he doesn't know, it's one of these rustlers, one of these thieves coming, he's not going to allow access. But of course, we've already seen they're not going to come by the door because they know they're not going to be granted access to that. In verse 4, it says, the shepherd call his sheep by name. Call his sheep by name, and they know his voice and follow him. This particular point of the shepherd exhibits that the shepherd has this deep and intimate, close relationship with his sheep. So the shepherd obviously knows his sheep, but the sheep also know the voice of the shepherd. And oftentimes, he may even have individual names for each of the sheep. If one of them's getting a little away from the herd, he might call them in by name. There's a particular show that Abby and I have recently been watching, and it takes place in the early 20th century. It's in the Highlands of Scotland, and I think even today there are many sheep herders. It's very primitive still in a lot of the ways it would have been done even a couple centuries ago. And even now, in many ways, those farmers and those herders, that is their livelihood. And so they are going to take care of their sheep. They are deeply invested in these sheep. And so if they become sick, they're going to use every measure possible to save those sheep. And the show that we watched is about vets during that time tending to various farm animals and even pets that were becoming popular at the time. And so they use a lot of those measures, go to any length possible to care for the sheep. So then in continuing here, in verse 5, it says, they will by no means follow after a stranger. Okay, so they're going to flee because they don't know his voice. So the sheep of the shepherd would have no reason to follow after me if I went into a sheepfold somewhere. They don't know me at all, and I don't know them. Just as I was kind of researching this for like real world application, I came across some videos there was one in particular where these two young girls were trying to call the sheep to them, And they even got the shepherd's rod and were trying to go up to the sheep and see if they could get him to come to him. They just scattered. They just scattered from them. But as soon as they gave the rod back to the shepherd and he approached, they came right to him because they knew exactly who he was. And there was security there. So it's going to be harder for any one of us to round up those sheep because I think this also goes back to the intimate relationship. There has been a relationship cultivated between the shepherd and his sheep. It's not that it's not that when that shepherd goes to buy the sheep at market that they trust him immediately if he goes to market. I know there's some born there on the farm or in the sheepfold, but there has to be some sort of long-term relationship cultivated over a period of time for that trust to be there. I think there's application for us in terms of leadership, or the sheep as it would pertain to elders in a church, and the sheep as it's referred to by Paul in other epistles. There's only reason for trust if the leaders cultivate a certain relationship there. I think we can draw conclusions there, and in other places as well with parents and children. That's certainly there as well. Just bring up some photos here to kind of get maybe this in our minds a little more about what a sheepfold is even. This is a sheepfold, and even the olive groves in the top left-hand corner. This is in the hills of northern Gilead in the Transjordan. So this would have been between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, somewhere in between there. And this was taken again by Farrell Jenkins that I've gotten some photos from in the past. This is another one. This is actually a sheepfold in Galilee. This one even has a cave in the back, so even that demonstration of extra security that the shepherd would provide for his sheep. And really, what I was alluding to earlier about the shepherd laying down as a door, you can kind of imagine that if there's a gap anywhere here in that stone wall right here, he would lay down, and the sheep aren't going to cross over that, not until they get confirmation from the shepherd. Okay, you can go out now. Okay, you can come in now. It's really an amazing thing that we talk about, or the Lord talks about us as sheep in many ways. I know it's been alluded to many times. Sheep are really dumb animals, right? They're really stupid. There's even one video I've seen where a shepherd is pulling a lamb out of a deep sinkhole. He's just using all of his effort, all of his strength to get that sheep out. And then the lamb runs off and he runs into another hole right after that because he's stupid. He doesn't know what he's doing. And he doesn't know that that's bad for him. And so I think maybe there's a lesson for that in us as well, that again, we don't know the right way. As the Pharisees thought they had the right way. They thought they were the shepherds. They should have been the shepherds in a way, but they were in fact not. This is another photo, another sheepfold that's also in the Holy Lands, and you can see. I can't tell if that's a kind of a clear image from y'all's standpoint, but you can see the pastures, how when the sheep are led out, that talking about Psalm 23, leading out to green pastures. This is a shepherded village in Nazareth, and this is even in kind of a cave. So again, that demonstration of security and comfort. These were even some, I believe, yes, Steve Klein took photos of these. These were sheep that had gotten lost from the fold. They were on the side of the road and there was no shepherd nearby. And so they had to be brought back into the fold, hopefully. And then these were some of the flocks that he had also seen in the wilderness there in Judea. In verse 4 again, this idea of the shepherd know his voice and they follow after him because they know of his voice. There was also one video that I came across, and it's sort of similar to this one, where it's just a man, I assume a shepherd, that's standing out in a field, and I think this was in the Highlands of Scotland as well. And it's just this dense fog. You can't see anything. He can't see in front of his face, but he starts calling. It's this, I guess, a certain herd call. It's not any name of a sheep. But then you don't hear anything for a second. Then after a couple seconds, you start to hear this bleating off in the distance, the bleating of sheep. And one by one, the sheep start coming to him, and it's just droves of sheep that come to him because they know his voice. And I think that was such a powerful demonstration of this passage. And similar to this, you see how they're all flocking together and they gladly follow after the shepherd because he offers that security. And I think there are some obvious correlations to Psalm 23. We'll draw some of those out as well, about how the shepherd offers that security and that comfort. Well, in verse 6, it says there, Jesus used this illustration, but they did not understand the things which he spoke to them. Okay, so they don't even understand this, at least some of them don't. Then Jesus said to them again, most assuredly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. So this is where he affirms, I am the door. All who ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly. And we'll stop there for a moment. So again, Jesus is the door of the sheep. I think this is maybe even an allusion to what we're going to read in John 14, that he is the way, he's the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. He's even going to expound on that a little bit later on here in chapter 10. So those who came before him, they were thieves and robbers. The sheep did not follow him or know him. So if anyone enters by Jesus, that is the door, says he will be saved. And some of the translations, the actual meaning of that is they will be kept safe and sound. Okay, so again, that sense of security, and they will have access to this pasture. So again, the shepherd, if he is the door, we're thinking about that illustration. The shepherd is the last line of defense. For if the sheep try to escape through the door, well, he is the door, so he can stop them. Or if they're trying to come in, he's the only one that can allow access into that. Now, of course, we already saw the thieves and the robbers. If they try to come up against the door, they are going to be denied access. And so that is why they try to come in another way. They try another way. Someone might say, why not just leave the sheep in the pasture? Well, there's less security there. So we talk about the thieves and the robbers trying to come into the sheepfold. You saw in those photos how small they were, and how there's little chance that anyone, if the shepherd is nearby, that anyone is going to come in and steal those sheep. If a wild animal comes in, the shepherd is right there and he can deal with it. But if they're in pasture, the shepherd is with them and he leads them to water, he leads them to food, but there's a lot more chance for a wild animal or somebody else to come in a wide open expanse for something to happen there. Well, in verse 10, we already read that, but verse 11, I am the good shepherd gives his life for the sheep, but a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, so this is someone that has been maybe hired by the shepherd, hired by somebody else to keep watch of the sheep. Let's see, a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. The wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. So he doesn't have a real relationship with them. Yes, he's been given charge of them, but he doesn't have any real skin in the game, right? He's only in it for the money. He's much like a mercenary for a foreign country. Yes, he is fighting for their armies, but the first sign of trouble, if it's not looking good for him, he can just get hired. He can just go off and get hired by somebody else if it looks like that army is going to be wiped out. Okay. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd and I know my sheep, and am known by my own. And we'll stop there in verse 15, because that's another point that we want to get to, one that we've already hit on, but I'll hit on that briefly here in a moment. So again, I think in particular in these verses, this is another good demonstration of the fulfillment, how Jesus is, of Psalm 23. That the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me by the still waters. He restores my soul. The application of Psalm 23 to God's people, it has not lost its potency. It has not lost its application to us today. And so again, if we don't understand it, I think there's some room there for us to learn about the culture of the day so that we can better understand how God acts towards us. It says the thief seeks his own welfare, destroys the flock. We certainly don't have time to read this passage, but I would highly encourage you to go over to Ezekiel 34 if you get the chance, and to read that passage. That is a fantastic demonstration of how there are shepherds that are not the shepherds, that try to come in and draw God's people away. I'll read, or I'll just give a synopsis of the first little bit there. So it's basically in verses 1 through 5. It's these ones that are posing as shepherds. Maybe they're even a hireling, and they're kind of putting on airs that they are like the shepherd. But in fact, they were thieves. They were hirelings. They don't care for the sheep. They don't have any real concern for the sheep. They're only concerned about themselves. And so, as we see here in John chapter 10, as soon as that wild animal, that wolf, comes in, they flee. They don't want to deal with that. So I think even there, not only does he not have concern, he doesn't have commitment. The hireling does not have any real commitment to the sheep. Even though he's been given charge, he's not really committed to the task at hand. I think back to the couple of times where David in the Old Testament describes the encounters that he had with wild animals, with a bear or a lion. And I can't even imagine that, honestly. I mean, and he had a sling. Of course, God was on his side, and he guided him and gave him the victory in those instances, like with Goliath. You imagine that. A lion or a bear. There's been several counts. Mr. Martin's been giving some counts of some bear activity in the area lately. I think some of you might even have had some encounters yourselves. And those are black bears. These would not have been black bears. Out in the wild, those that are hungry, they are after the sheep. The shepherd will do anything he can to protect the sheep, even if it costs his life. That's what Jesus says here. The shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He will go to any length possible to save them, to preserve their life. It says in the passage, he wants them to have life abundantly. Okay, we've noted already 24 times in the Gospel of John, the word life is used. 23 times it's attributed to Jesus. Here's another point where it's attributed to Jesus. He wants them to have life more abundantly. Okay. Again, him bringing that truth, bringing them living water, bringing them forgiveness, all of those things he's giving to them. Okay, so continuing, I believe in, verse 15. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Okay, so that's what I just mentioned there. He lays down his life. And other sheep I have which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from the Father. Okay, so once again, who is Jesus appealing to? Even in this illustration of the shepherd and the sheep, who is he, or what authority is he appealing to? It's that of the Father, right? The good shepherd knows the sheep. He also knows the Father. So there's extra security, the best security there is, right? So he knows the Father and the Father knows him. It says in verse, and this is applicable to us. This is talking of us. Verse 16, other sheep I have which are not of this fold. This, I think, is talking of the Gentiles that would be brought into the fold of God. After Jesus is crucified, he's buried and then resurrected, and then on the day of Pentecost, as the church is established, and later the Gentiles are brought into that church. I think that is the flock that is being talked about here. They will hear his voice. There will be one flock and one shepherd, Jesus says here. There are several passages, again, we could go to. We don't have time to do that this morning, but that talk about that idea of the one flock, of the one church. Well, in verse 19, we'll finish here this morning. Verse 19, therefore there was a division again among the Jews because of these sayings. And many of them said, he has a demon and is mad. Why do you listen to him? Okay, so that's not the first time they've given that charge to Jesus. Others said, these are not the words of one who has a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? Okay, so this is, again, evidence that this is happening pretty close to what had just happened in chapter 9. They're appealing to that which Jesus had done in the healing of the blind man at the pool of Siloam. Now it was the feast of dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. Then the Jews surrounded him and said to him, how long do you keep us in doubt? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Stop there. In those verses, I'll just wrap up here quickly in this particular section. So again, we already covered that some had pointed that he was a demon. Some said, no, it's impossible. How can someone do this that heals a blind man? So this, again, getting to our timeline of where we're at. Verse 22, now we are not in the same time frame. This is now the Feast of Dedication. If you recall, we had previously been in the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, starting in chapter 7 all the way up through verse 21 of chapter 10, it would seem. Okay, so that had taken place in around September, October, in that time frame. It even says here in verse 22, it was now winter. So the Feast of Dedication, this is what is commonly known for us today as Hanukkah. Okay, so this was this would have been given after, it was an 8-day Jewish holiday commemorating the rededication of the temple after the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC. So we are now, give or take, about 3 months removed from what we've seen in chapter 7 all the way through about midway into chapter 10. Okay, so we're moving into that way. And that's going to be important for a couple reasons that we're not going to cover this morning. We'll cover next Sunday. But that got us through just about where I wanted us to get. And hopefully we can finish up chapter 10 and move into chapter 11 next week with the raising of Lazarus, which is, again, a most powerful miracle, probably the most important miracle aside from Jesus's own resurrection. And hopefully we'll look at that. Any closing comments that we have this morning before we dismiss? All right. Appreciate your good attention this morning. Look forward to our period of worship here in a few moments.